Hello, I'm Paul Merrill. I'm from Beaufort Fairmont Automated Testing Services, and I'm here today to talk about what tests should we automate first. A little bit about me and Beaufort Fairmont. I am the founder of Beaufort Fairmont and a principal software engineer in test here. We work with teams to help them sync up testing in agile environments with development. We also work with teams to help them increase the amount of test automation they have in their testing departments. And so we hit on these topics quite a bit. This is one that came from our last webinar. I asked folks what they wanted to talk about, and this was one of the topics that got the most response. So I'm looking forward to making sure that everybody gets what they want out of this today. And I'm looking forward to any response you may have about this. This is a recording I'm recording this in late October of 2016, but I'm always open to hearing more about your thoughts with this type of thing. So here we are. So let's get started. So first of all, make sure to mark your calendars. If it's still before these dates in 2016, I'll be at the Better Software Conference in Orlando, Florida in November from the 13th to the 18th. If you're going to be there, make sure to give me a yell. If you see me, flag me down. Let's talk. I want to hear about your automation, your challenges with test automation, what you're doing in your environments, what works, what doesn't work, and just getting to know folks. I really want to get to know what people are up to and what their challenges are with test automation. This next webinar will be on the 21st of November, so mark calendars for that. You can always go up to the website and find the next one. We've got a page up, beaufortfairmont.com/webinars, and you can find the next one there. TISCA is a local testing meetup, and myself and Angie Jones will be doing a workshop we're preparing called Dominoes of Automation. And it's using dominoes to toppling dominoes that hit one another in chain reactions in order to talk about the principles of good test automation and to figure out exactly, to help teams figure out how automation works and to learn some of the best practices there and things to avoid. So that's going to be tons of fun. Join us out there on the 8th of December if you can. And I'll also mention in January of 2017, I will be a part of the Automation Guild's first conference. So I'm looking forward to that. Look up Automation Guild online. Joe Calantonio is putting this on. He does a great job with his podcast called Test Talks, and now he's taking some of his favorite speakers from favorite interviews from that and putting them together on a virtual conference called Automation Guild. So you can go from anywhere in the world and watch that the 9th through the 13th of January. But let's talk about what we came here for. What tests should we automate first? So usually when we're talking about this particular question, it's because something is new. It's either the people involved, meaning us, our team. It's possibly the application has changed or something related to the application has changed. Maybe the system under test has changed somehow. Maybe test tools have changed or the technology involved. Maybe our skill sets have gotten better and we're looking to implement new skills across our teams and organizations. Maybe it's some or all of the above, but something has changed, and that's why we're asking this question. And so as we look through tests to automate first, we want to kind of look at the reality of the situation, and being aware of what's new and what's changed is one part of that. Another part of it is our expectations, and we need to think about what we expect from automation. Here I'm using we somewhat generically. What do we ourselves expect from it? I think it's good to write that down to actually enumerate exactly what we expect from our automation, from our automated tests, what goal we're trying to meet, but then also having the stakeholders make it clear what they expect as well. If you have stakeholders that aren't very involved, well, you've got challenges there. I suspect there are more challenges than just with test automation in that case, but we're looking for making sure that the folks who are involved in this and who want this to work, the people sometimes don't want it to work. We want to make sure that we know all the expectations coming in, and this gives a good lay of the land to answer the question that we were talking about. So in terms of expectations, I think that most of us who look into test automation and who want to see automation succeed, we look at test automation as if one day we're going to walk in and a whole bunch of robots are going to be ready to go. and they're going to be waiting for something to do. So what we need to do is introduce them to the system under test, which I'm representing here with a symbol that looks like a laptop. And basically, all we should have to do is point these robots, these test cases, over at the system under test, and it will check to make sure that the system under test is working properly. In fact, we sometimes have expectations bigger than this. We would like to see these robots, these test cases, work against many systems under test, or many different versions of it. And what I find with that expectation is that in general, I have folks end up very sad about it, and they look like this poor guy or girl. And I've seen it myself. I've seen plenty of executives and managers who look exactly this way when their expectations for test automation are not met. So it's very important for us to examine what those expectations are as a part of understanding where we are today. The next thing that I would say is that really what we want to do is we want to bridge the gap between a test case that's automated and the system under test being verified. That's really what we're looking for, and I represent that here with a question mark. Some of the typical approaches, and the ones that you'll read out there, even some of the experts out there say that this is how you would approach this. A lot of them are very intuitive, but we like to think about maybe the longest test, for instance. So the one that takes the most amount of time to run manually. Perfectly reasonable way to think about this. In that case, what we're generally trying to do is to reduce the amount of labor we use running test cases and replace that with an automated test case to do that. And that can potentially work. Many times we look at a regression suite that's already built, one that's written by humans for humans, and we say, well, regression takes a long time. For instance, we've got 25 people working for 3 weeks to do a regression for our system. I hear clients say that. I hear people say that. And what they're trying to do in that case is to reduce the amount of time that it takes for regression, or to be able to use their people to do other things like test new features, or do exploratory testing on an application, or work on a new application coming out instead of a legacy one. Perfectly reasonable. That's something that people would want to replace. Complex tests. Many times we say, well, you know, these tests are pretty complex. There are a lot of details in it, and computers are very good at dealing with details. So let's automate those. In fact, usually the first item here and the third item that I'm talking about are usually in line with each other. So a lot of times the longest test is also the most complex test case, and those are the things that I can see people wanting to automate. Many times people talk about highly repeated tests, things that are done again and again and again, and I can totally understand where that comes from. If it's repeated, no human wants to do it that many times. There are humans that would do it, but generally not our typical testers or folks involved in testing. The problem is these don't work, and I'll tell you why. So the first one is too big. And what we find is that, remember what we're talking about here, usually there are new skills involved for testers or for the people doing the automated testing. And that means that they're going to have to learn a lot of different things in order to get that longest test to run in an automated fashion. So it's too big. It's too much work to throw in someone for their first automated test. And it's too much for most teams that are starting to automate on a particular piece of testing work. Regression. Well, regression, the problem is that it's human oriented. Think about how we test things as humans. When we go in, for instance, into a user profile on a web page and we look at, we want to verify that certain fields are there. Well, as a human, we wouldn't necessarily want to waste our time by going back to the login and coming back in and testing each field, testing one field and then going log out and log back in and test another field. And we know as we're doing it whether or not we failed on something and can make note of that. Automated tests generally do not do that. And we don't necessarily want that. We can use computers for what they're really good at, and we should use humans for what they're really good at. Regression in its typical format and long complex tests that are written by humans for humans generally are set up so that the human being is best served. A computer doesn't care how many times it logs in. It doesn't care which thing it's looking at. It doesn't care if it's on the user profile for 20 minutes or for half of a second. What it cares about is doing exactly what we tell it to do. And one of the really nice benefits of not looking at tests as if they are for humans, and not looking at test cases or checks, I guess some folks would say, as if humans are going to do them, is that we can have a computer go in and check one specific field or two specific fields of something like a user profile, to use that same example again. And if a test case only does that and nothing else, then we know when it fails that that test case failed because of those one or two fields. As opposed to if you write an automated test the human way. And so as a human would write it, the test case would end up failing for one of what could be hundreds or dozens or hundreds or thousands of verification points. When that's the case, then that test case fails. Suddenly you have a whole lot more maintenance work to do and troubleshooting to do to determine why it failed. Now your logging may be very good, but you're still going to have to go through that logging and understand exactly what something failed and why it failed. So really in that case, when we take the approach of using human-oriented tests and just writing them as scripts of automation, what we find is that we replace the time that it took to do this with humans with a nearly equal amount of time of creating the test case. Once again, usually a very complicated, difficult to write test case for people who are probably new to this, as well as troubleshooting again and again throughout time, plus more difficult and more brittle tests to deal with over time. So when you take that complexity out and you make these tests smaller and more computer-oriented or machine-oriented rather than human-oriented, there are a lot of gains that you can make. You can look at the results of a test and know exactly why it failed very, very quickly, which saves us all time and makes life much easier for us. Usually complex tests are very difficult to write, meaning you have to upskill very quickly with your testing tool if that's new to you, and it's a lot to ask of someone new to a testing tool. Think about highly repeated tests. Why are we repeating these so much in the first place? Is it because something's wrong with the system under test? Probably. So what is it exactly that we're trying to accomplish by testing this particular piece of functionality again and again? Is it that this piece of functionality is used a whole lot by users? And if so, why? Why haven't we solved that in the application to begin with? Why can't we, batch up some of that work in some way that would be more beneficial to our human users? But remember, something is new here when we're doing this, and most of those new things require some type of learning. So I want to make sure to talk about learning curves here. So I put together this graph here to talk about learning curves, and in this case the learning curve is a new tool, and this new tool, whatever it is, whatever new tool we're learning, it may be a new testing tool or something of that sort. We've all seen things like this before, and you may start with some level of skill with a particular tool, but it takes work and time to get to a certain amount of proficiency. And when we get there, then we can kind of take off and do great things with this tool, great things for our organization, great things for our test team. But that's not usually how this works. Usually the way that we work with automated tests is we have some new learning curve and we add to it by things like adding complexity or urgency. And you notice here, if I go back, you'll notice that curve just got smashed down. So we're going to learn a lot less over time. It's going to take us longer to learn things because we added complexity to what we're asking and urgency. How often do we have people say, look, we really need to show that we're paying off this tool right away, so I need to see some really good testing done very, very early? Well, it's about the worst thing you can do for programming. And by the way, automated testing in many cases does involve programming, many times with people who are not used to it. So adding urgency in that case does not necessarily help. And then looking for large chunks of the application to take care of initially does not help either. It just elongates the curve and causes us to take more time before we reach a level of complexity or a level of proficiency. But that's not all we do. Usually we add more than one learning curve. So for instance, we might be learning a new programming language at the same time as we're learning a new tool. And when we do deal with learning curves, adding a learning curve does not make things faster. It makes learning slower. So if you have two learning curves you're working on here, it may take a much more extended period of time to deal with these tools and to get to a level of proficiency. But usually we do even more than that. A lot of times we add a new domain, a new set of business logic, a new market that people have to learn about, and a new application to deal with. So we may never even get to a level of proficiency if we do all of those at the same time. Finally, the pressures that we add are not limited to complexity and urgency. We generally want to do things at scale. So we take these new things that we're going to learn, these new tools that we're going to learn, we're going to do automation in this new environment, and then we're not going to do it for one group, let's do it for everybody. And so adding this and doing it at scale, you can see pushes those learning curves down even farther to the point that it's basically impossible to get to a level of proficiency prior to having a significant collapse of the automated testing frameworks and initiatives we're working on here. But you know, it's not just that. I just wrote a blog post a few days ago. Once again, right now it's 2016, late October 2016. You can find this on my blog on the corporate website, beaufortfairmont.com/blog. And I talked about piecemeal work for automated testers. And one of the things that I see happening a lot with organizations is they say, okay, we want to do automation, but what we're going to do is we're going to have a person who's traditionally been a manual tester start learning automated testing. And we're going to divide up their time so that they do 50% automating regression tests, and 50% of their time they're going to do manual testing on new features. And that's about one of the worst things you could possibly do, is splitting up time to that degree. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe very strongly that people who do automated testing should also do some level of manual testing. And in fact, I think it's necessary in order to do any manual testing. If you don't go in and actually try out the application, how do you know that what you're trying to automate actually works, or how it works, or how it's supposed to work? So that's very important. But splitting up those jobs, splitting up those roles in such a way that you manual test these things over here and you automated test these things over here with part of your day 2 days a week or 3 days a week, it's just not a pattern that I've ever seen work very well. It can work in certain situations, but not in most. So if we know that learning curves are important and climbing them, having our people climb them is important, we need to be nurturing them. So how do we nurture them? And I'd like to suggest that the #1 nutrient for learning curves is simplification. So let's simplify what we're doing with these teams. And this is the way that I suggest simplifying, and the way that it works with many of my clients over time. #1, we're going to have very few people working on an automation initiative at the beginning. We might have 1 or 2 people or 3 people. But once you get up to more people than that, just the lines of communication between all of those individuals is so complex that the initiative has trouble gaining traction and get going. Further, the people who are very good at it are going to be leaned on even more to learn the application and to learn the testing tools and to learn the skills that they need, that the team needs, such that the team as a whole can't move forward fast enough to meet the investment that was given for this. That was put into it, I guess is a better way to say that. We want to create the simplest test possible, and we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. But we're going to start out with the simplest test possible, and we're going to create that. We're going to make it repeatable, because in large portions of test automation, we want repeatable test cases. Not always the case. I've certainly had situations where I automated something that I would only do once because maybe it was a gigantic job and it was easier for me to automate it than to do it by hand, even one time. But in most cases, when we're talking about automating testing, we want something that's repeatable. So let's take this test case that we've used very few people to create. Let's make it the simplest test we can possibly make it. Let's make it repeatable. And then let's start making it work on different environments. I like test cases in most cases to work on a tester's environment, to work on a developer's environment, so that developers can use it for debugging and troubleshooting, to work exactly the same on those environments, to work in a staging environment, potentially a testing environment, maybe we have a smoke environment or something along those lines, to work in every environment that we want to put this in. I want to try that very, very first I want to get it into continuous integration. That's what CI stands for here, because I want to make sure that this very simple test can work in every piece of our deployment system. I want to make sure that after that we start creating small variants of the test and persisting those as other test cases. So we'll have changes to inputs, changes to verifications. We'll have, and then I'd like to learn with those copied tests how to abstract out pieces that can be reused. So I want to know, how do I reuse pieces of my framework? That's something that I have to learn very early on. I want low pressure, low urgency on this. One of the worst things you can do for new programmers is to put a lot of urgency on them. That's just not a good idea. Don't put pressure on people when they're learning things initially, especially something as hard as programming. It's not something that tends to work very well. That doesn't mean let things last forever. We still want productivity and we still want things to happen in a timely manner, and I'm trying to give you here a formula for how to do this in a timely manner. But high pressure, high urgency just doesn't normally work very well with these things. Run tests in parallel, ordered and disordered. I want to be able to do all these with very, very simple test cases. So what we're doing here is we're basically taking the idea of thin vertical slices from the world, and we're putting it into the automated testing world. We're saying, I want to build one test that can run in all these different environments, that I can run in continuous integration, that I can run multiple instances of that test at the same time in specific orders, and then not. I want to create very simple variants of it, copy those off. I want all those to run at the same time or in different orders, and just make sure that I've isolated my test cases, that I don't have dependencies between one test and another. This is a very good way to start, by simplifying out this process. And by doing this, what we end up with is building confidence with small wins. Now, when I did this webinar live, someone asked the question with this last slide about continuous integration. They said, but Paul, look, do we really want to expose our first test cases to a large audience like developers and stakeholders through continuous integration early on? Well, you'll notice here I say, let's get this into continuous integration, but I didn't necessarily say make it public. So one of the things that you may need to do in your situation is to try these things out in a limited exposure way, because we want to build confidence not only for ourselves, but we want to build confidence outside of ourselves, across the testing team, across the development team. And the way to do that is to practice things small, to get them working really, really good, to work out all the kinks as early as possible with really small steps, and then start exposing it to others. One of the things that I hate seeing is the idea that an organization has to come to terms with the maturation of automated testing. I don't believe that has to be the case. And I'll say that again because it was a lot of words there, but I believe that companies should not have to come to terms with the organization of with the confidence we can have of the automated test cases we build. In other words, I want confidence right from the very beginning in this system. The first time that I expose this to a developer, I want all the kinks worked out. We're testers. We look at other people's code that comes to us and we expect great things from it and for it not to break. We should expect exactly the same from ourselves. So if we need to put acceptance tests around our automation efforts, then absolutely do it. If we, in turn, and by that I mean acceptance criteria. If we need to write down exactly why we're doing this and what we hope to achieve with it, then let's do that. If it means making sure that we can run in continuous integration environments and that we can do that in such a way that we can run 25 times and get exactly the same results from the same cut of code on the same environment without any other factors involved, then that's what we need to do. So I said we would come back to the idea of the simplest test. So that's what I want to do here. The simplest test is one where we have one or two inputs, one or two actions, and one or two verification points. And in that particular test, and a lot of people will call these checks, and I'm going to avoid that terminology and argument for the moment. But if we can create our automated tests in such a way that the first ones, the simplest ones, only have a few inputs, one or two inputs, an action, and a verification point, that's a great place to start. That's what I want to look at. Now, this might mean in your web app environment that your first test is load up the application in the browser and know that it loaded, be able to verify it. It might be just that simple. It might be that the login page comes up and we can see the user field in it and maybe the password field. It might be just that simple, and in many cases I think it will be. For a RESTful API, for instance, it might be that when you go to that API you get a 200 back, a 200 response code back. Excuse me. So it may be just that simple, and that's exactly what I'm looking for, is something that simple. Now we're not going to stay that simple forever, but remember the question here. The question is what test do we want to automate first? And that's what I'm trying to give you a roadmap for. One of the things that I think is overlooked a great deal when we're learning new skills, especially ones that are like programming, and many times test automation is programming. I think a lot of times we see that we can do a little bit with a piece of code and we want to do these big, ginormous projects. And many times we don't know what that gigantic project is and how big it is. We don't have reference points. So I want to give you an idea of how small it should be and how small the steps are that I use on a day-to-day basis when I'm automating tests. I would do something like this if I'm developing my first test for an application. First of all, I would write the test automation to load the application, and then I'd say, does it work? And by does it work, I mean I'm going to run the test, the automated test, and see if it loads the app. Personally, I'm going to look at it and make sure that it worked. Secondly, I'm going to try an input, so I'll input something, and I want to see if that works. So I'll run the test again and make sure that the app's still loaded and that the input worked. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have a verification point after each one of these within your test. I'm saying that the verification point is you, as the developer of this automated testing, verifying that each step that you take, you verify as you go through. And this is a better pattern for success in developing automated tests than trying to write out a lot of code. Even 10 lines of code is too much to start out with. We want to start very, very small. We want to create a verification point, and then we want to see if that works. So I want to make our steps in developing these tests very, very small. So that's what I'm talking about there. What tests should we automate first? That's the question we've all come here for. The answer I have is the simplest thing a user could do. One of the questions that I had on the webinar when I did this live a little while ago was, what user are you referring to here? And I was thinking about web applications. I was thinking about a human user, a customer of a web application, but plenty of people are writing applications that are RESTful APIs, and so it may not even be a human that's using this. It may be a client, a bot of some kind, whatever. I don't want to get caught up too much in the user aspect of this, but it's the simplest thing that a user can do. That's what I'm looking for. Automate this. That's what we want to go for. And basically, at that point, what we've done is we've taken an automated test and we've verified that a piece of the system works just like we expect it to. So what should we automate first? These are the steps. Start small, stay simple, learn, build confidence, and repeat. And I really believe that this building confidence aspect is so overlooked in getting these initiatives started. Client after client that I work with, if I can get them building small things, celebrating small wins, and building that confidence as they go, it is so powerful. The opposite of that is also true. If we are experiencing a lot of failure again and again and again in a public way, that's not very helpful to anybody. And many times the momentum for those projects runs out very, very quickly. So find a way to start small and the big things will come. You will add to your suite over time. You will build bigger tests over time, but ramp up gradually. Create a lot of test cases that are small so that you know exactly what each one does and why they work or fail. Once again, I'm Paul Merrill. I do a podcast in addition to working with Bo for Fairmont. I do a podcast called Reflection as a Service. I write a lot on our corporate web page. Please email me if you have questions or thoughts, paul@boforfairmont.com. Find me on Twitter, @paulmerrill, and like us on Facebook. I would love to hear your comments, your thoughts, your suggestions. You can get to us through this number at the bottom, 984-244-2313. That's our corporate number. If you do not get a hold of us, we're on the East Coast and we kind of do basically 9 to 5 type work. But if you can't get a hold of us, please leave a message and we'll get back to you as soon as possible with your name and your information. I want to hear about your challenges, what you do in automated testing that works and what doesn't work. So I look forward to hearing all those. Please reach out to me if you're at any of the events I mentioned earlier. You're welcome to email if you'd like a copy of these slides. And I hope that you have a wonderful day and that you've learned a lot from this. Thank you so much.